From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. When the history of this period is written, it'll probably go down as the moment the West woke up and realised the world had changed.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
It's hard to imagine a scenario in which this could have gone worse. This seems to be a dream come true for Vladimir Putin.
Well, it's not an overstatement for sure to say that it is one of the most astonishing moments that we have ever seen happen inside the Oval Office.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Today, Donald Trump irreparably destroyed the 80-year-old post-World War II international order. His total abandonment of Ukraine in front of the cameras was on display for the entire world to see. It was a truly historic moment, not in the good way. One that I fear realigned the world order, upending the only foreign policy consensus that most living Americans and Europeans have ever known.
Newspapers around the world are highlighting what appears to be a realignment of U.S. alliances and a stunning turn towards Russia. On Friday, in a heated confrontation in the Oval Office, President Trump and Vice President Vance berated President Zelensky in an explosive and unprecedented televised showdown.
How did that meeting in the White House go so wrong? What does it mean for Ukraine? And is this the end of the Western alliance as we know it? The story today: Trump, Zelensky, and a fierce onslaught in the Oval Office.
I'm Ben Hoyle. I'm the foreign editor of The Sunday Times. As you can probably hear, I'm a bit under the weather at the moment. I was very much hoping for a nice quiet end to the week of our foreign schedule last week. And then, as everybody listening knows, the world sort of exploded on Friday. So, feeling slightly sorry for myself today.
And Ben, as we're talking, that week of news continues.
Absolutely.
European leaders have scrambled to this emergency summit in London. Zelensky arrived on Saturday. This meeting was actually scheduled before events on Friday night. Just remind us, what was the hope? What were they hoping to achieve and who was invited?
The idea was to bring together, I think it's 17 or 18 leaders from most of the main European countries, plus the NATO Secretary General and the presidents of the European Commission and European Council, to try to sort of pull together a Western peace plan for Ukraine that could then be presented to the Americans. President Zelensky is the key person in this. We've all been watching since President Trump took office the dramatic shuttle diplomacy between Washington and Kyiv and Moscow and Saudi Arabia in terms of trying to thread the needle between some suddenly very different perspectives on how to find an end to this war. That President Trump campaigned in 2024, partly on a promise of easily ending the war in Ukraine. He said it would never have happened on his watch, but that certainly once he got into power, it was something he was determined to do. And ever since he came in, it's been clear that there's a whole different energy behind US policy towards Ukraine. Europeans, recognizing that they're from a position of some weakness, are trying to assert as much influence as they possibly can over how that settlement gets framed.
And Ben, you mentioned the week of frantic shuttle diplomacy with Washington, D.C. Just take us back to the start of last week with Macron turning up in America. Just describe how those talks have been going.
So Emmanuel Macron, who in Trump's first term pulled off a brilliant feat of flattering Trump by bringing him to a huge, I think it was the Bastille Day parade, which deeply impressed Trump. He came home wanting to do one in America. Macron's very adept at handling him. He went over to the White House at the beginning of the week. They got on very well, even though Macron fact-checked Trump in real time in front of the press when Trump said that the US had vastly outspent Europe on its aid to Ukraine. Certainly that they had different kind of guarantees with the money that they'd given to Ukraine, and Macron corrected him in front of everybody, and Trump seemed to accept that, which was a surprise to many.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
The general feeling was that meeting had gone well. That was followed shortly afterwards by our own Prime Minister Keir Starmer going to Washington. There was big build-up to that, a lot of anxiety as to how that would go down because they've not always seen eye to eye, and obviously he's a Republican president and he's a Labour Prime Minister that Trump hasn't had real dealings with before. But that also went very well. Keir Starmer came with an invitation for a second state visit from King Charles that Trump was apparently delighted by, and the tone was very warm.
Can I present a letter from the King to you?
Thank you very much. That is really nice. And that's quite a signature, isn't it? How beautiful. He's a beautiful man, a wonderful man, and we appreciate it. I've known him, gotten to know him very well, actually.
Starmer went out of his way to be as agreeable as possible in company with Trump, and it seemed to go down extremely well. That set the table for the biggest visit of the week, which was Friday, which was President Zelensky flying in, we were told, to sign a mineral deal which has been cobbled together in the last few weeks between the US and Ukraine. This deal has been the subject of frantic speculation in the days leading up to the White House meeting. It had been on, it had been off. We are told, the reporting suggests, that Trump had talked of little else behind closed doors other than, once he got into his head, the idea that America could be compensated for its involvement in the Ukraine war, for its support of Ukraine, by a long-term stake in Ukraine's vast rare earth mineral wealth that is believed to lie under its soil. There are huge complications with extracting those minerals in that many of them lie in the areas of Ukraine that are currently occupied by Russian troops. There are also, beyond that, massive complications in refining the minerals, in that most of the rare earth mineral refining capacity is in China. But nevertheless, President Trump was convinced that this was a way to present a deal to the American people, that he had walked away with a big win from Ukraine financially for America. Louise Callahan, our brilliant Sunday Times correspondent in the US, her reporting during the week said that from the Ukrainians' point of view, they felt that they were also getting a great deal because they felt that it was sufficiently vaguely worded not to really tie them down to anything that was calamitous for them, but that it also would keep America in the country and involved and with a stake in continuing to be a sort of viable nation. And going into the meeting, there were mostly warm vibes. That said, there were some concerns that before Zelensky went in, he met with a bunch of US senators who emphasized to him that it was incredibly important that he did not lose his temper, get emotional with Donald Trump, that he didn't try to push back if Trump didn't give him the security guarantee that he wanted. There's also abundant reporting in the US that Trump was offended that Zelensky didn't wear a proper suit. He felt he hadn't dressed up smartly enough for him. Although, two things that you'd want to point out there. One is that Zelensky, since the war started, has worn a form of military dress in solidarity with the soldiers in Ukraine and said he won't wear a suit until the end of the war. But also, if you look back at old pictures, Winston Churchill during World War II visited the White House not wearing a suit, wearing a sort of Winston Churchill boiler suit type thing. Elon Musk regularly turns up in the White House wearing a T-shirt and a baseball cap. But nonetheless, this was perceived as a slight by Donald Trump.
Pretty close. How are you? Pretty shut.
He's all dressed up today.
That was the moment when it started to feel like things weren't quite going to plan. Because, as you say, anybody who's seen Zelensky over the last 3 years has seen him dressing up in the same way. It felt almost as if he was prepared with a line on that. It was almost an ambush when Zelensky arrived about it. This is when they're shaking hands outside the meeting.
Yeah.
For Zelensky, clearly there'd been a lot of anticipation about this meeting. As you say, the Americans had been briefing that this was the signing of the minerals deal. It was all on the table. For Zelensky, we now hear that there was a bit more that he was hoping to get out of the trip. Just remind us what he needed assurances on for this deal to happen.
What Zelensky has said all along is that whilst the mineral deal is encouraging because it pulls America into Ukraine, what he really needs is a security guarantee. And all the best wishes in the world from world leaders are all very well, but what he really needs is someone who will stand up and say, we're going to protect you. We're going to provide the backstop for you. And that's what Starmer had gone to Washington looking to convince Trump that there needed to be a firm commitment to a US military guarantee of the rest of Ukraine's remaining territory. And he didn't get that from Trump. And Zelensky went to Washington essentially hoping that, I think that his own personal charisma, face-to-face with Donald Trump, a deal maker, that they would, between them, face-to-face, be able to make an agreement that involved a security guarantee for Ukraine. And he didn't get it. And that came up during the press conference that follows.
Well, tell us about that, because it started pretty well, and then it all began to unravel. What were the real sticking points?
Well, it was an unusual press conference. It was an extremely long press conference in the Oval Office with a large cast, not just a cast of journalists, but also Donald Trump and Zelensky, but also right next to Donald Trump and facing Zelensky, you had J.D. Vance, the vice president, who Zelensky would have been well aware is not a friend of Ukraine and hasn't been for a long time. You had Zelensky's staff, you had the Ukrainian ambassador, who later on in the meeting would have her head in her hands as everything went off the rails. But, I mean, normally these White House press conferences are very brief. The idea is that the press get a sense of what the actual meeting is like, but that the real meeting happens behind closed doors. Whereas here, what was so astounding about it was that everything played out in full view of the world in live time. The meeting was sort of tense but cordial. Once the journalists got involved asking questions, there were moments of spikes of tension earlier on, such as when there was a suggestion to Trump that he wasn't aligned as much with Ukraine as he was with Russia, which he pushed back on a lot, saying that, of course, he wasn't aligned with Ukraine or with Russia. He was the whole point for him to be able to strike a deal is that both sides have to see him as completely impartial.
I'm not aligned with Putin. I'm not aligned with anybody. I'm aligned with the United States of America and for the good of the world. I'm aligned with the world, and I want to get this thing over with.
They seemed to get over that. They were heading towards the end of the meeting. Then they were going to go off and sign the minerals deal, and then they were going to have a nice lunch. And then J.D. Vance, the vice president, took some offense at something that Zelensky was saying and accused him of disrespecting the United States and the Oval Office by coming to Washington and essentially not showing sufficient gratitude for all the support that the US has provided.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Zelensky has often, over the course of the last 3 years, shown how incredibly grateful Ukrainians are to the rest of the world for supporting them. But Vance felt that he hadn't been sufficiently grateful in this meeting in front of the cameras. And Zelensky, who had been warned not to rise to any bait in this environment, you see the body language. He folds his arms and he argues back in a way that neither Starmer nor Macron had done when they were at the Oval Office and might have heard things that they didn't totally agree with. And from that point on, the last 10 minutes of the meeting just went completely off course.
And just describe how bad it got. I mean, you mentioned J.D. Vance, who made a number of comments which would have been frustrating for Zelensky to hear. For example, he said Zelensky had been campaigning on behalf of the Democrats in Pennsylvania when actually he'd visited an ammunition factory to thank Americans for helping Ukraine. So doing exactly what J.D. Vance said he hadn't. When Zelensky sort of corrected him on this, which is sort of what we'd seen Macron doing earlier in the week, Donald Trump also piled in, and it really did turn into a shouting match. Just describe what was happening.
It's genuinely a shouting match. There are raised voices, the body language is very aggressive, and Zelensky is, he's outnumbered. He's there representing a smaller, weaker nation in its hour of need, speaking not in his first language. English is perhaps his third language after Russian and Ukrainian. He's having to manage a great deal of difficult things in that moment. He also has to defend his nation's honor, really, essentially, in that moment. He can't be seen to, for Ukrainians, his audience back home at Ukraine, he can't be seen to allow them to say things that he knows to be wrong. Vance had suggested that Ukraine should try diplomacy. He's essentially accusing them of being warmongers, that all they want is to keep fighting. They don't want to try and strike a deal. And Zelensky points out to him, as calmly as he can, that they have frequently, in the course of the 10 years since Russia first invaded Crimea in 2014, that they have made repeated agreements with the Russians, which Putin has then gone on to break. And that obviously further enrages Trump and Vance. I think they're responding to Zelensky's tone as much as to what he's actually saying to them. And Trump is infuriated that Zelensky's correcting Vance in front of him. And by the time that you get to Trump telling Zelensky that he doesn't have any cards to play, and Zelensky is telling Trump, we're not talking about playing cards here, it's very clear that the whole thing's, gone to a point where it's not going to get resolved in that meeting in front of everybody.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
But the real question then is, are we looking at something that people would be able to walk away from, cool down and resume negotiations, which perhaps that would have been possible if it was all going on behind closed doors? Or does the fact that this has happened mean that this is just a line in the sand after which perhaps nothing is ever going to be the same again?
Donald Trump described it as great TV, which is perhaps the only saving grace from that press conference. But I think a lot of people around the world watched with horror.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that President Zelensky, had been briefed not to lose his temper, to try and have a more emollient tone. Do you think he got that wrong? Or, as you say, is it important for him in front of the world's media not to accept things that aren't true? Because that would then form the basis of any further negotiation. If you accept that your country has been a warmonger, or accept that your country hasn't been keen on peace, have you just made that a part of official history because all the cameras have watched you not disagree to it? It's a really difficult position. What do you think he should have done?
It is enormously complicated. Zelensky's, we've all seen, he's a sensationally gifted communicator. He, like Trump, is an entertainer or a TV personality. He's tremendously adept at subtle communication. And I think on a different day, the Zelensky that we've seen charming the world could have found a way to handle that situation more diplomatically. That's not to say that he did the wrong thing. It's easy to understand if you've come from a country that's been on the receiving end of what Ukraine's been on the receiving end for the last 3 years, and then you turn up in that atmosphere. It's easy to understand why he slightly snapped, but I'm sure he left afterwards thinking, I wish that I'd handled that slightly differently. That said, he went on Fox News later that evening and he said, I'm not sure that we did anything wrong. He sounded genuinely bewildered that, he hadn't accused Trump and Vance of selling Ukraine down the river. He hadn't accused them of being in cahoots with Vladimir Putin. He could have done, but he didn't. He was, to my ears, restrained and moderate. But I think it's really amazing how strong the kind of animus against Ukraine is amongst a lot of the people around President Trump. A lot of the people in his circle are just fed up with Ukraine. They see Ukraine as losers. They see it as a drain on American national resources. I think there's a sense that they just see it as a sort of a TV show that's jumped the shark and is no longer very interesting. It isn't changing enough anymore. It's not very exciting. It's clear there are people around Trump who see rebuilding bridges with Russia as a huge economic bonanza, much more exciting than rebuilding a devastated Ukraine.
And, you mentioned before, J.D. Vance, for example, said a lot of this in the run-up to the election. We saw Ukraine almost become part of the culture war. They didn't see why they should be helping. They saw it as a complete drain on American resources. And it's part of that sort of Biden progressive coalition that they hate everything about it. That's J.D. Vance and Trump World's position on it. Just tell us about Trump himself, because he has history with Zelensky. As he pointed out, he did send weapons to help Ukraine in his first term, but they also had a bit of a falling out. Now, we did a whole podcast on this last week, so if you're listening and you want to hear more, do go back and have a listen. But just remind us briefly of some of the animosity there.
One of the things that this press conference reminded us was that Trump and Zelensky, they have bad blood that dates back to 2019, when the first impeachment against Donald Trump was to do with Ukraine. It was allegations that Trump had tried to essentially pressure Zelensky, who was then newly installed as president of Ukraine, into investigating Joe Biden and Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, over the activities of the company that Hunter Biden worked with in Ukraine, because Joe Biden was going to be running against Trump in the 2020 election. And that, even though Zelensky said that he hadn't felt pressured by Trump, there's a sense that Trump blamed Zelensky over that 2019 impeachment inquiry. The other thing that came out of Friday, very loud and clear towards the end, was when Trump was talking about Putin. And it reminded us that in Trump's first term, he might have fallen out with Zelensky, but he formed clearly a real bond with Putin. I don't think I've ever heard him explain it as clearly as he did on Friday, but he talked about how when Zelensky was saying that Putin essentially is not a man of his word, he's someone who breaks diplomatic agreements, ceasefire agreements, Trump responded that, well, he did that because it was Biden or because it was Obama that was in power at the time. He wouldn't do that with me. And when he was asked why, he said, because we trust each other, essentially. And asked why, he said, it's because we went through the whole Russia, as he called it, the Russia hoax, the federal investigation into whether Russia had meddled in the 2016 US election that brought Donald Trump to power for the first time.
They broke it with Biden because Biden, they didn't respect him. They didn't respect Obama. They respect me. Let me tell you, Putin went through a hell of a lot with me. He went through a phony witch hunt where they used him and Russia. You ever hear of that deal? That was a phony Hunter Biden, Joe Biden scam. Hillary Clinton, Shifty Adam Schiff. It was a Democrat scam. And he had to go through that. And he did go through it. We didn't end up in a war.
Trump's version of those events was that he went through the fire with Vladimir Putin as essentially the victims of the US intelligence agencies investigating them, which I thought was completely extraordinary, really, to hear him say it like that. But it reminded us that he has a bond with Putin and he doesn't have that bond with Zelensky.
Ben, you described how on Friday night there were incredibly warm words from Donald Trump about Vladimir Putin. After that disastrous press conference, will there be a sense for Russia that things are going rather well?
Yeah, I think there's clearly a strong sense in Moscow that things are going, you hesitate to say according to plan, but that things are going brilliantly for them. Just today, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, who's been in that job for a very long time, couldn't disguise his glee, really, that you now have the United States voting with Russia on Ukraine in the United Nations.
In a move that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks ago, the U.S. voted against a UN General Assembly resolution supporting Ukraine. The U.S. was joined in their no vote by Russia and Moscow allies North Korea, Hungary, and Belarus.
I think he's actually said that it seems that US policy aligns with our vision. These are astounding things to be hearing from a country that has invaded its neighbour and started the largest war in Europe since 1945. There's no way of sugarcoating it anymore.
And we saw that bombed building early last week when there was an extraordinary moment in the UN where Russia and the US were on one side with much of Europe opposing them. Just tell us about that.
I think even, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think even China and Iran abstained in that vote. The US was voting with Russia and I think North Korea on a Ukraine resolution that basically didn't blame Russia at all for the war.
So, Ben, while there are clearly celebrations in Moscow about all that's played out, how will it be going down in Kyiv? I mean, how long can Ukraine carry on if nothing changes?
I don't think the tap, in terms of the military aid, I don't think the taps get switched off instantly. The US is still committed to billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine, some of which is currently frozen in the way that all their foreign aid has been frozen. And there's some suggestion in Trump circles that that might not end up getting delivered, and that gives Ukraine 6 months of supplies. It's not so much the money that Ukraine needs, it's the production capacity and the place in the queue that they're going to miss. So at the moment, most of the military aid that comes from America just comes rolling off the production line from America. Most of the military aid from Europe, 3/4 of it, Europe has to buy from other countries, most of all, and particularly the US. So the aid that they're getting from the US is, Ukraine's currently at the front of the queue with Israel. After this, if Europe is having to make up the shortfall, the rate of supply is going to be really key.
Do you think Europe can plug the gap? They'll be talking about that desperately at this summit that's taking place at the moment. Do you think they'll be able to do enough to plug the gap for Ukraine? And do you think behind the scenes, not in what we hear in the press conferences, behind the scenes, do you think they'll be putting pressure on Zelensky to quit, to try to get America back on board?
I think Zelensky is kind of allied with Ukraine in the minds of the MAGA, the Trump circle. I think, if it was General Zelensky of Ukraine, who's more popular with Ukrainians than Zelensky is, and is perhaps for that reason has been sort of semi-exiled to London as the Ukrainian ambassador. If he was to be parachuted in as the new president, who knows? I don't personally think it would make an enormous difference. And
can they come together to plug the gap if he can't get America back on side?
I think I saw today that a former Secretary General of NATO said there's absolutely no way that Europe can stand on its own without America as the same kind of a credible military alliance. Ultimately, is NATO already effectively dead? Because NATO is really the sort of a question of faith as to, do we believe credibly that if a NATO nation is attacked, then all the other NATO nations will respond to protect it? And there's only one country in NATO that has anything like the nuclear stockpile to be a real head-to-head rival to Moscow, and that's the US. And at the moment, does anyone really think that if Putin were next year to send some troops into Estonia, which is a NATO member, that Donald Trump would start firing nuclear weapons to protect Estonia? And I don't think anyone thinks that.
Ben, we've mentioned America backing Russia and North Korea at the UN. We've talked about the weaknesses now within the NATO alliance and no sense that Europe can rely on America turning up to help, even if it was to trigger Article 5. It does feel like this could be the end of Pax Americana, the end of the Western alliance as we know it. For you, as the Sunday Times foreign editor, is that something you ever thought you'd be reporting on? How much do you worry about what it means for the future?
Yeah, of course you worry a lot. One of the weird things about the job that I do is that because you're so closely focused on how to cover it, it's to some extent in the moment, it's not that it's just work, but you are focused on who to commission, to send to do what stories, which pieces of analysis, Are we covering all the angles that we want to cover? And that doesn't leave a great deal of room in your brain for it to percolate down and for you to really sit back and reflect. That comes later, often weeks later. This one, though, is a bit different for me. I was Moscow correspondent for the Times when Putin invaded Crimea and then eastern Ukraine in 2014 and spent a lot of time there. I have a lot of empathy for the plight of the Ukrainians. I was then a foreign correspondent in America during Trump's first term. So I have a sense as well of, to a lot of Americans, this stuff doesn't look as extreme and inexplicable as it does to people on this side of the Atlantic. Still, I am amazed at how seismic a turn it is in terms of our international story over the last 100 years, because, you know, America has always prided itself on being on the side of the democracy against the non-democracy, on the side of the liberator rather than the aggressor. And whilst I can rationalise a lot of the political support for what Trump and Vance are pushing, there are factual errors about the way that they're describing the situation in Ukraine, not least the idea that Zelensky is a dictator and that Ukraine started the war. That is Russian propaganda coming out of the mouths of senior American politicians. Those are Kremlin talking points, and they're not true. It's been quite a thing to think about where this leaves the world. If the European leaders meeting in London today can figure out the right way to make a pitch to Trump to bring him back into the tent and make him feel great about it, then perhaps that's still doable. But one thing is definitely for sure is that we seem to be in an era that's sort of almost post-democratic when it comes to dealing with the US, in that I know Trump was elected democratically and there was no question about the fairness of his victory. But the way that he is behaving in office feels much more like we're in the realm, you know, of a king or of an emperor, where you have subjects turning up from distant lands and everything is personality politics. It's national interest being funneled through the mood and instincts of one person, and that's absolutely extraordinary. It's also something that Vladimir Putin is perhaps more experienced at dealing with than some of our leaders.
That was Ben Hoyle, foreign editor of the Sunday Times. And you can find all the latest coverage on Zelensky, the London summit, and what comes next online at thetimes.com. And you'll also find full coverage all day on Times Radio. The producer today was Chris Wade, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design was by David Crackles. If you'd like to get in touch with us about this or any other subject, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.